The distant rumble of thunder shook the horizon as Grace Reynolds clutched her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, her feet bleeding and blistered from walking miles across the unforgiving Texas terrain. Her once fine traveling dress was caked with dust, her copper hair falling in tangled waves down her back as she stumbled along the rutted wagon trail that stretched endlessly through the vast prairie. The year was 1873, and the promise of a teaching position in the frontier town of Willow Creek had drawn her west from Philadelphia. The stagecoach robbery 3 days prior had left her stranded, her belongings stolen, and the other passengers scattered or dead. Grace had been walking ever since, rationing the small canteen of water a kind farmer's wife had given her the previous morning. As the first fat raindrops began to fall from the darkening sky, Grace felt her knees finally give way. She sank to the ground at the side of the road, too exhausted to cry, too dehydrated for tears. The distant sound of hoofbeats barely registered in her consciousness until they slowed and stopped beside her. "Madam, you all right there?" The deep voice carried genuine concern. Grace lifted her head with effort, squinting against the rain to see a tall figure on horseback. He dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing broad shoulders beneath a worn leather duster. As he approached, he removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked chestnut hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. "I'll share everything I have," he said, his voice gentle as he crouched beside her. "It ain't much, but there's water, food, and shelter waiting at my ranch not 2 miles from here." I'm fine," Grace managed, though her cracked lips and swaying posture betrayed her. The cowboy's weathered face softened with a kind smile. "No offense intended, madam, but you look far from fine." He held out a calloused hand. "Name's Vaughn Nicholson. My ranch is just over that ridge." "Storm's coming fast, and I can't in good conscience leave you here." Grace hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling hand in his. "Grace Reynolds," she whispered hoarsely. "I was headed to Willow Creek, teaching position." "Willow Creek's still 30 miles west," Vaughn said, helping her to her feet. "You'll never make it before this storm hits full force." He gestured to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion. "Rusty here can carry us both to safety." Before Grace could protest, Vaughn had lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. One strong arm encircled her waist to keep her steady as he turned the horse toward home. "Just lean back and rest," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I've got you." Grace wanted to maintain her proper distance, to insist she could manage on her own, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. She found herself leaning against the solid warmth of his chest as the rain began to fall in earnest. Within moments, they were galloping through the downpour, the world narrowing to the rhythm of hoofbeats and the security of the stranger's arms around her. The journey passed in a blur of rain and thunder. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the steady heartbeat at her back and the occasional murmured reassurances from the man who had found her. When they finally slowed, she forced her eyes open to see a modest but well-built ranch house emerging from the gray curtain of rain. "Home sweet home," Vaughn said, guiding his horse to the covered porch. "Let's get you inside and warmed up." He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Grace's legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, and Vaughn caught her effortlessly, lifting her into his arms. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "I'm sure you can, Miss Reynolds, but there's no need to prove it right now." He carried her up the steps and somehow managed to open the door without putting her down. The interior of the ranch house was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall of the main room. Vaughn set her gently in a rocking chair near the cold hearth. "Stay put while I tend to Rusty," he instructed, already moving to rekindle the fire. "Then we'll see about getting you dry clothes and something warm to eat." Grace wanted to object, to maintain some semblance of propriety, but she could only nod as he struck a match to the kindling. Within moments, flames were licking at the dry wood, sending welcome heat into the room. Vaughn disappeared outside, and Grace found herself studying the home of her rescuer. A bookshelf stuffed with well-worn volumes stood against one wall, surprising her. A rough-hewn dining table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a curtained doorway presumably led to sleeping quarters. Everything was neat and organized, not what she had expected from a bachelor rancher. Vaughn returned, shaking water from his duster. "Rusty's settled in the barn," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Now, let's take care of you." He moved with efficient care, bringing her a towel for her hair and disappearing behind the curtain, returning with a flannel shirt and pair of trousers that would clearly swallow her whole. "My late sister's," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "She lived here with me for a spell before consumption took her 2 winters back. These should fit better than anything of mine." Grace accepted the clothes with murmured thanks, touched by both his thoughtfulness and the shadow of grief that crossed his face at the mention of his sister. "You can change behind that curtain," he said, gesturing to the bedroom. "I'll heat some stew and make coffee." When Grace emerged some time later, wearing the borrowed clothes with her damp hair combed and braided, Vaughn had a steaming bowl of stew waiting. He poured her a cup of strong coffee, then sat across from her with his own meal. "So, Miss Reynolds, what brings a lady like yourself to these parts?" he asked, his tone conversational but his eyes keenly observant. Between bites of the surprisingly delicious stew, Grace told him about the teaching position in Willow Creek, how the school board had recruited her from Philadelphia with promises of good wages and respectable accommodations. "My parents passed last year influenza," she explained. "There was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia, and I've always wanted to see more of the country." "So you came all this way alone?" Vaughn's expression was difficult to read. Grace nodded. "The stagecoach was attacked 3 days ago, just past Fort Worth. The driver and guard were killed. I managed to hide in the brush until the bandits left." She shuddered at the memory. "They took everything, my trunk, my reticule, with all my money. I've been walking since, hoping to reach Willow Creek somehow." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "The Sutton gang, most likely. They've been plaguing this territory for months." He refilled her coffee cup. "Did you get a look at any of them?" "Only glimpses. They wore bandanas over their faces." Grace sipped the hot coffee gratefully. One had a scar through his eyebrow and another was missing 2 fingers on his right hand. "Jed and Morris Sutton," Vaughn confirmed grimly. "Sheriff's been after them for a year now." He shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Reynolds." "Please call me Grace," she said, surprising herself with the familiarity. "And I know how fortunate I am, especially that you happened along when you did." A hint of a smile warmed his serious face. "Then you should call me Vaughn." He leaned back in his chair. "Seems to me you have 2 choices. I can take you to Willow Creek once the storm passes, or you can rest here a few days first. You look like you could use the recovery time." Grace hesitated. Propriety dictated she should continue to her destination as soon as possible. Staying unchaperoned in a stranger's home was scandalous. Yet her body ached with exhaustion, and the thought of traveling 30 more miles immediately filled her with dread. I should reach Willow Creek as soon as possible," she said reluctantly. "The school term starts in just over a week." Vaughn studied her face. "The storm's likely to last through tomorrow at least. Roads will be mud pits after. Realistically, we couldn't leave until day after tomorrow anyway." He stood, collecting their empty bowls. "So that's settled. You'll rest up here and I'll take you to town when the weather clears." Grace was too tired to argue. As Vaughn washed the dishes, she found herself struggling to keep her eyes open, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. "You need sleep," Vaughn observed, drying his hands on a towel. "You can take my bed." "I'll bunk out here by the fire." "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "You've been through hell, Grace. Take the bed." Too exhausted to protest further, Grace allowed him to show her to the small bedroom. A simple iron bedstead with a patchwork quilt dominated the space, alongside a chest of drawers and small washstand. "Sleep as long as you need," Vaughn said from the doorway. "I've got chores to tend to in the morning, but I won't be far. Holler if you need anything." "Thank you," Grace said, the words wholly inadequate for all he had done. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." Vaughn shook his head. "Out here we help each other. It's how we survive." He hesitated, then added softly, "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Vaughn." The door closed, and Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by all that had happened. She had lost everything, nearly died on the open road, and now found herself in the home of a stranger, a kind, gentle man who asked nothing in return for his help. Tears she'd been too dehydrated to shed earlier now flowed freely as the day's events caught up with her. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and Grace fell into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in days, lulled by the sound of rain and the knowledge that, for tonight at least, she was safe. Morning light filtered through the small window when Grace finally stirred. For a moment, she was disoriented, then memories of the previous day flooded back. She sat up, wincing at her stiff muscles and the lingering soreness in her feet. The house was quiet, but a glance at the small clock on the dresser showed it was already past 9. Grace hurriedly washed her face in the basin, combed and rebraided her hair, and straightened her borrowed clothes as best she could. The trousers and flannel shirt felt strange after a lifetime of corsets and petticoats, but she had to admit they were comfortable. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room empty but neat. A note propped against a coffee pot on the stove caught her attention. Gone to check fences after the storm. Help yourself to breakfast. Back by noon. Grace found bread, butter, and preserves laid out on the table along with a small pot of honey. The coffee was still warm and she poured herself a cup, touched by Vaughn's thoughtfulness. After eating, she felt restless. Her mother would have been appalled at the idea of a guest snooping, but Grace couldn't resist exploring the bookshelves. She found a surprising collection. Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau, and Whitman mingled with practical guides to ranching, animal husbandry, and frontier medicine. One shelf held what appeared to be journals, dozens of them, each labeled with a year. Curiosity got the better of her, and Grace pulled one marked 1870 from the shelf. Opening it, she discovered not a journal but a novel manuscript, the pages covered in neat, masculine handwriting. The title page read Prairie Fires by Vaughn Nicholson. Grace gasped. Her rescuer was an author. She flipped through the pages, reading passages here and there, increasingly impressed by the vivid descriptions and authentic dialogue. The story followed a young man's journey west and his struggles to establish a homestead amid the dangers of frontier life. The sound of boots on the porch startled her, and Grace hastily returned the manuscript to the shelf. She was standing guiltily by the fireplace when Vaughn entered, bringing with him the fresh scent of rain-washed air. "You're up," he said, removing his hat. "Feeling better?" "Much, thank you," Grace replied, hoping her face didn't betray her snooping. The sleep did wonders. Vaughn hung his hat and duster by the door. "Storm did some damage to the north fence line, but nothing I can't fix." He glanced at the empty breakfast dishes. "Found something to eat, I see." "Yes, thank you. It was delicious." Grace hesitated, then gestured toward the bookshelf. "You have quite an impressive library." A flicker of something pride, embarrassment, crossed his face. "Reading passes the long winter evenings," he said simply. Grace bit her lip, then decided honesty was best. "I hope you'll forgive me, but I couldn't help noticing. Are you a writer?" Vaughn's expression tightened. "Found those, did you?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not a writer, just a fool with too much time on his hands." "I wouldn't say that," Grace ventured. "I only read a little, but what I saw was quite good." He looked genuinely surprised. "You're being kind. I'm being honest," she countered. "I've read enough literature to recognize talent." Vaughn seemed uncomfortable with the praise. He changed the subject. "How are your feet today? I noticed they were pretty torn up yesterday." Grace glanced down. "Still sore, but much improved." "Let me take a look," he said. "I've got some salve that might help." When she hesitated, he added, "I doctored the ranch hands for years before we had a proper physician in these parts. I promise I know what I'm doing." Grace reluctantly sat in the rocking chair while Vaughn fetched a small tin from a cabinet. He knelt before her, gently examining her blistered feet. "Not as bad as I feared," he murmured, applying the fragrant salve to the worst spots. "Another day of rest, and you should be able to travel without too much discomfort." His touch was clinical and respectful, but Grace couldn't help the warmth that crept into her cheeks at the intimacy of the moment. No man had ever touched her feet before, and there was something strangely tender about the way his calloused fingers moved with such care. "Thank you," she said softly when he finished. "For everything." Vaughn's eyes met hers, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Then he cleared his throat and stood. "Hungry for lunch. I can make us some sandwiches before I head back out to finish those repairs." They ate together, and Grace found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet rancher. Despite his initially taciturn manner, Vaughn proved to be well-spoken and knowledgeable on a wide range of subjects. He told her about his 10 years on the ranch, building it from nearly nothing after returning from the war. "Were you with the Confederacy or the Union?" Grace asked, immediately regretting the potentially divisive question. "Union," Vaughn answered without hesitation. "My family never held with slavery, came from Pennsylvania originally like you." "What brought you to Texas?" A shadow passed over his face. "Needed a fresh start after Gettysburg, lost too many friends there." He paused. "My sister Rebecca was out here, married to a rancher. When her husband died of typhoid, I came to help her run the place. Then she passed too, and it was just me." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. Understanding the loneliness of losing family, Vaughn shrugged. "Life out here teaches you to keep moving forward." He stood, clearing their plates. "I'd better get back to those fences. Feel free to rest or read. Make yourself at home." After he left, Grace found herself drawn again to the bookshelf. This time, she pulled down the most recent manuscript, dated 1873. She settled in the rocking chair by the window and began to read. Hours slipped by as she lost herself in Vaughn's story. This one was different from the first she'd glimpsed, more polished, more confident in its prose. It was a romance, she realized with surprise, about a frontier doctor and a widow who comes to his town seeking a new life. The characters were richly drawn, their growing love depicted with sensitivity and emotional honesty that took her breath away. "Didn't expect to find you still reading that." Grace jumped, looking up to find Vaughn standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him return. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have, it's all right." He came in, setting his hat aside. "What do you think, honestly?" Grace closed the manuscript carefully. "I think it's wonderful," she said. "You have a real gift, Vaughn. Have you ever tried to publish your work?" He shook his head. "Sent a few stories to magazines back east. Got nothing but rejection slips." He moved to stoke the fire. "Besides, ranching keeps me busy enough." "But this is too good to sit on a shelf," Grace protested. "The story of Caroline and Dr. Mitchell, it's moving and authentic. Any publisher with sense would see its value." Vaughn's cheeks colored slightly at her praise. "It's just scribblings to pass the time," he insisted. "Nothing worth fussing over." Grace wanted to argue further but sensed his discomfort. Instead, she carefully returned the manuscript to its place on the shelf. "I hope you don't mind that I read it," she said. "I couldn't help myself once I started." A small smile tugged at his lips. "I don't mind," he admitted. "It's nice to have someone read my work." "Rebecca was the only one who ever did. She must have been very proud of your talent. She was the one who encouraged me to write in the first place," Vaughn said, his voice softening with memory. "Said I told the best stories she'd ever heard." Grace smiled. She was right. Their eyes met across the room, and Grace felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. There was something about this quiet, thoughtful man that intrigued her more with each passing hour. The moment broke when Vaughn cleared his throat. "We should think about supper," he said. "And tomorrow we can head to Willow Creek if you're feeling up to it." The mention of Willow Creek brought Grace back to reality. Yes, she had a position waiting, responsibilities to fulfill. This brief interlude at Vaughn's ranch was just that, an interlude. "Yes, of course," she said, pushing away a strange sense of disappointment. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It's no imposition," Vaughn said quickly. "Having company has been nice." They prepared supper together, falling into an easy rhythm as if they'd done it countless times before. Grace found herself laughing at Vaughn's dry observations about ranch life and sharing stories of her own childhood in Philadelphia. By the time they sat down to eat, the initial awkwardness between them had dissolved completely. After the meal, they lingered at the table, talking as the light outside faded to dusk. Vaughn spoke of his dreams for the ranch, the struggles of the early years, and his hopes to expand his small herd of cattle. Grace told him about her teaching experiences, her love of literature, and her decision to seek adventure in the West after her parents' deaths. Weren't you afraid? Vaughn asked. Coming all this way alone, Grace considered the question. I was, she admitted. But staying felt more frightening somehow. The house was so empty after they died, and everywhere I looked held memories. I needed something new, something that was just mine. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. I felt the same after the war, couldn't go back to my hometown, too many ghosts. They fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Grace found herself studying Vaughn's face in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward. He was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way that she found increasingly appealing. I should turn in, she said finally, unsettled by the direction of her thoughts. If we're to make an early start tomorrow, of course. Vaughn stood collecting their dishes. I'll have everything ready for the journey. It's about 4 hours to Willow Creek, so we should reach town by early afternoon. Grace nodded, suddenly reluctant to leave the warmth of his company. Good night, then. Good night, Grace. In the small bedroom, Grace changed into the nightgown Vaughn had found among his sister's things. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of Vaughn moving about in the main room, she found herself wondering what life might have been like if circumstances were different. If she'd met Vaughn Nicholson in the normal course of events, rather than as a desperate woman on the side of the road, she pushed the thoughts away. Tomorrow she would be in Willow Creek, beginning her new position, and Vaughn would return to his ranch. Their paths had crossed briefly, nothing more. Yet as sleep claimed her, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in her world during these 2 days of unexpected shelter. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm's aftermath evident only in the puddles that dotted the yard and the fresh, clean scent of the air. Grace dressed in her own clothes, now cleaned and mostly mended thanks to Vaughn's sister's sewing basket. Her feet, treated again with Vaughn's salve the night before, felt remarkably improved. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Vaughn already up, packing provisions for their journey. He'd hitched a wagon rather than saddling his horse. Thought this would be more comfortable for you, he explained, seeing her surprised look. Rusty can pull us both to town easy enough. That's very thoughtful, Grace said, touched by his consideration. They ate a quick breakfast, then loaded Grace's few belongings into the wagon. As they prepared to leave, Grace took a last look at the small ranch house that had been her sanctuary. I can't thank you enough, she said softly. You saved my life, Vaughn. Anyone would have done the same, he replied, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true in these harsh frontier lands. The journey to Willow Creek passed more quickly than Grace expected. The wagon bounced over the rutted road, but Vaughn had padded the seat with blankets, making it reasonably comfortable. They talked easily as they traveled, the conversation flowing naturally between them. Tell me about Willow Creek, Grace said as they crossed a shallow stream. Have you been there often? Every few weeks for supplies, Vaughn replied. It's growing fast, about 500 people now. They've got a proper school, church, several stores, even a small hotel and restaurant. He glanced at her. You'll like it, I think. Good folks, mostly. Mostly. Grace raised an eyebrow. Vaughn chuckled. Well, every town has its characters. Sheriff Davis keeps order well enough, though. As the morning wore on, Grace found herself treasuring these final hours with Vaughn. There was something so comfortable about his presence, so reassuring. The thought of saying goodbye left an unexpected ache in her chest. There it is, Vaughn said finally, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. Willow Creek. Grace felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as they approached the town. Neat wooden buildings lined the main street, with smaller homes scattered around the periphery. A white clapboard church stood at one end of town, while a 2-story schoolhouse occupied a grassy lot near the center. That'll be your school, Vaughn said, nodding toward the building. They drew curious glances as they rolled down the main street. Vaughn guided the wagon to a stop in front of a modest building with Willow Creek Hotel painted on its facade. We should find the school board chairman first, he said. Mr. Abernathy runs the general store. He pointed to a large building across the street. Grace nodded, suddenly nervous. Yes, of course. They crossed to the store, Vaughn's hand lightly supporting her elbow. The bell over the door jangled as they entered, and a portly man with mutton chop whiskers looked up from behind the counter. "Nicholson," he greeted with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you in town this week." "Mr. Abernathy," Vaughn replied. "I've brought Miss Grace Reynolds. I believe you're expecting her." Abernathy's expression shifted to confusion. "Reynolds, the schoolteacher," his brow furrowed. "But we received word you weren't coming. The stage company telegraphed that you'd been killed in the robbery near Fort Worth." Grace gasped. "What? No, I survived. I was walking to town when Mr. Nicholson found me." Abernathy looked genuinely distressed. "Well, this is awkward. You see, when we thought you weren't coming, we hired someone else. Miss Barton arrived on yesterday's stage from Dallas." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. You filled the position." "I'm afraid so," Abernathy said, looking genuinely regretful. "The school term starts Monday and we couldn't leave the children without a teacher." Grace swayed slightly and Vaughn's hand steadied her. "There must be something that can be done," he said firmly. Abernathy shook his head. "I'm truly sorry, Miss Reynolds. We've signed a contract with Miss Barton now. If we'd known you were alive." "Of course," Grace said faintly. "You had no way of knowing." "The least we can do is reimburse your travel expenses," Abernathy offered, "and perhaps help you find a position in another town." "That's very kind," Grace managed, though the words felt hollow. Her travel funds, all her money, had been stolen in the robbery, and the idea of traveling alone again to an unknown destination filled her with dread. Vaughn's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "I appreciate your offer, Abernathy, but Miss Reynolds has been through enough. We'll discuss options and let you know what assistance she might need." He guided Grace gently from the store, his hand warm at the small of her back. "I don't know what to do," she whispered once they were outside. "I have nothing, no money, no position. Let's get some lunch and think this through," Vaughn said calmly. "Everything looks better with a full stomach." He led her to a small restaurant where they were served hot beef stew and fresh bread. Grace ate mechanically, her mind racing through limited options. She could telegraph her distant cousin in St. Louis, but it would take weeks to receive a reply and any funds. She had no other family, no close friends who could help. "What will you do?" Vaughn asked when they'd finished eating. Grace sighed. "I don't know. I have a little sewing skill. Perhaps I could find work as a seamstress until another teaching position opens somewhere." Vaughn was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "There's another option if you'd consider it." Grace looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "My ranch is doing well enough, but I've been thinking about expanding," he continued. "I could use help with the accounts, correspondence, record keeping, and—" he hesitated. "I've been considering starting a small school for the ranch hands' children and those from neighboring homesteads. There are 6 or 7 kids within riding distance who get no education at all." Grace stared at him, processing his words. "Are you offering me a job?" "Yes," Vaughn said simply. "Room and board plus wages. You'd have your own cabin, the one Rebecca used to use when she wanted privacy. It's small but comfortable." "Why would you do this?" Grace asked, genuinely puzzled by his generosity. Vaughn's eyes held hers. "Because you're a good teacher who needs a position, and there are children who need education. Because I—" He paused. "I've enjoyed your company these past days more than I can say, and because I think we work well together." Grace felt her heart quicken at the intensity in his gaze. "This is very sudden," she said carefully. "I know," he acknowledged. "Take some time to think about it. We can get you a room at the hotel for a few days if you'd prefer." Grace considered her options. Stay in town, spending money she didn't have while searching for work that might not exist. Try to reach another town with no resources. Or accept Vaughn's unexpected offer, a position that would use her skills, provide security, and keep her near a man whose company she genuinely enjoyed. "I don't need time," she decided. "I accept your offer with gratitude." A smile spread across Vaughn's face, warming his eyes. "You won't regret it," he promised. "We'll make those children the best educated in the territory." They spent the afternoon purchasing supplies Grace would need: fabric for new clothes, toiletries, teaching materials, and books. Vaughn insisted on paying for everything, saying it was part of setting up the school properly. When Grace protested, he simply said, "Consider it an investment in the ranch's future." By late afternoon, they were heading back to the ranch, the wagon loaded with their purchases. Grace felt a strange mixture of emotions: disappointment over the lost position, anxiety about her impulsive decision, but predominantly a sense of relief and even excitement about the path ahead. "I've been thinking about where to hold classes," Vaughn said as they traveled. "There's a good-sized storage room off the barn that could be converted fairly easily. Needs windows and proper flooring, but it has a sound roof and good walls." "How many children did you say there were?" Grace asked, already mentally planning lessons. "7 that I know of, ranging from about 6 to 14 years old. The Miller twins, the 3 Henderson children, and the Jackson boys." Vaughn glanced at her. "Most have had little to no formal education, so you'll be starting from scratch with some of them." "That's all right," Grace assured him. "I've taught mixed-level classes before. We'll make it work." They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. As Vaughn helped Grace down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, she felt a flutter of awareness that had nothing to do with her new teaching position. "Welcome home," he said softly, and something in his tone made the simple words feel significant. Grace smiled. "Thank you." The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Vaughn and his 2 ranch hands, Lewis and Charlie, worked to convert the storage room into a proper schoolroom. They installed windows, laid a wooden floor, built desks and benches, and even constructed a small blackboard. Grace sewed curtains, organized books and supplies, and developed lesson plans for her diverse group of students. The small cabin that would be Grace's home was indeed comfortable, with a bedroom, small sitting area, and tiny kitchen. It stood about 50 yards from the main house, offering privacy while keeping her close enough to share meals and company with Vaughn most days. Word of the new school spread quickly among the scattered homesteads. When classes began in early October, Grace found herself with 9 students instead of 7, as the widow Carson's 2 young daughters joined the group. The children were eager to learn, if somewhat unruly at first, and Grace found genuine joy in teaching again. Evenings were often spent with Vaughn, either in his home or her cabin, talking about the day's events, planning improvements for the ranch and school, or simply enjoying each other's company. Sometimes they read together by the fire, Vaughn occasionally sharing passages from his manuscripts and accepting Grace's thoughtful feedback with growing confidence. As autumn deepened toward winter, Grace realized she had found more than just employment at the Nicholson ranch. She had found a community, purpose, and increasingly, feelings for Vaughn that went far beyond friendship or gratitude. For his part, Vaughn seemed equally drawn to her. His eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. His hand would find reasons to touch hers passing a book, reaching for the same dish, steadying her on uneven ground. They circled each other carefully, neither quite ready to acknowledge the growing attraction between them. One crisp November evening, Grace was grading arithmetic papers in her cabin when a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Vaughn standing there, his expression serious. "Is something wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned. "No," he assured her. "But I've just received a letter I thought you should see." He handed her an envelope bearing the letterhead of Harper's Weekly. Grace opened it with curious fingers and read the brief message inside. Her eyes widened. "Vaughn, they want to publish your story," she exclaimed. "The one about the frontier doctor and the widow," he nodded, a mixture of pride and disbelief on his face. "I sent it 3 months ago before I met you, had almost forgotten about it. This is wonderful news." Grace impulsively threw her arms around him in celebration. Vaughn stiffened in surprise, then returned the embrace, his arms encircling her waist. The sudden awareness of his body against hers, the solid warmth of his chest, the subtle scent of soap and leather that was uniquely his made Grace pull back slightly, her cheeks flushing. But she didn't step away completely, and neither did Vaughn. His hands remained at her waist, his eyes searching hers. "I wouldn't have sent it without your encouragement," he said softly. "You made me believe it might be worth something." "It is worth something," Grace insisted. You have a gift, Vaughn. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. I have more than one reason to be grateful I found you on that road, he murmured. The air between them seemed to thicken. Grace felt her heart racing, aware they stood at the threshold of something momentous. Vaughn's hands tightened slightly at her waist. Grace, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I know it hasn't been long, but a shout from the direction of the bunkhouse interrupted him. Mr. Nicholson, rider coming fast. Vaughn reluctantly released her, stepping back. We'll continue this later, he promised, his eyes conveying what words had not yet expressed. They hurried outside to see Lewis pointing toward a cloud of dust approaching the ranch. As the rider drew closer, Grace could make out the uniform of a deputy sheriff. Nicholson. The man called as he reined his horse to a stop. Sheriff Davis sent me. The Sutton gang hit the bank in Willow Creek this morning. They're headed this way, likely planning to cut through your north pasture to reach the territorial line. Vaughn's expression hardened. Any casualties? They shot the bank manager, but he'll live, the deputy replied grimly. Sheriff's forming a posse. He asks if you'll join and if we can use your ranch as a base to cut them off before they reach the border. Vaughn nodded without hesitation. Of course, how many men is Davis bringing? 8, including himself. We're hoping to catch the gang in the narrow pass by Crescent Ridge. I know it well, Vaughn said. Tell Davis we'll be ready. The gang will have to water their horses at the creek that runs through my property. We can intercept them there. The deputy tipped his hat. Much obliged. Sheriff and the others should be here within the hour. As the deputy rode off to deliver the message, Vaughn turned to Grace, his expression grave. I want you to take the children and go to the root cellar. Lewis will guard you. The children aren't here, Grace reminded him. It's evening. Then just you, Vaughn insisted. The Suttons are dangerous men, Grace, if they realize I'm helping the sheriff. Grace understood his concern but shook her head firmly. I can help. I can prepare food for the posse, tend to any injuries if there's fighting. Grace, I'm not hiding in a cellar while you face danger, she said with finality. Besides, I've seen 2 of these men. I might be able to identify them for the sheriff. Vaughn looked like he wanted to argue further but recognized the determination in her eyes. All right, he conceded. But you stay in the house once they arrive. Promise me. I promise, Grace agreed, though the thought of Vaughn confronting the very outlaws who had nearly cost her life sent fear coursing through her. The next hour passed in tense preparation. Charlie rode out to warn the nearest homesteads, while Lewis checked weapons and ammunition. Vaughn pored over a rough map of his property with Grace, explaining where the gang was likely to pass and where the posse could intercept them. The creek narrows here, he pointed to a spot on the map. It's the only crossing for miles. They'll have to slow down to get their horses through. Grace studied his face, memorizing every detail as if afraid it might be the last time she saw him. Please be careful, she said softly. Vaughn's eyes met hers, intense and unwavering. I will, he promised. I have too much to live for now. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced the sheriff's arrival. Vaughn squeezed her hand once, then went to meet them. Sheriff Davis was a weathered man with a silver star pinned to his vest and a no-nonsense demeanor. He greeted Vaughn with a firm handshake, then accepted Grace's offer of coffee for his men while they discussed strategy. The Suttons have been a thorn in my side for too long, Davis said as they gathered around Vaughn's table. This time we've got them cornered. They stole over $5,000 from the bank, too heavy a haul to ride fast. We'll catch them at the creek crossing. Grace served coffee and the leftover stew she'd quickly heated, listening as the men finalized their plan. When the sheriff mentioned the distinctive features of the gang members, she spoke up. The man with the scar through his eyebrow is Jed Sutton, she said, and the one missing 2 fingers is Morris. I saw them during the stagecoach robbery last month. Davis looked at her with new respect. You'd make a good witness at their trial, Miss Reynolds, if we take them alive, one of the deputies muttered. The sheriff silenced him with a look. We do this by the book. I want these men to face justice properly. As the posse prepared to leave, positioning themselves to ambush the gang at the creek crossing, Vaughn pulled Grace aside. Stay in the house, he reminded her. Lock the doors. I will, she assured him. Just come back safely. Vaughn hesitated, then in a swift movement, pulled her close and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief but unmistakably passionate, conveying everything they hadn't yet said aloud. "That's a promise to continue our conversation," he said hoarsely when they parted. "Wait for me." Then he was gone, mounting Rusty and riding out with the posse, leaving Grace standing on the porch with her heart pounding and her lips still tingling from his kiss. The waiting was excruciating. Grace paced the small cabin, jumping at every sound, straining to hear gunfire or returning hoofbeats. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. She tried to distract herself by planning the next day's lessons, but her mind kept returning to Vaughn, his kiss, the promise in his eyes, the danger he now faced. It was well past midnight when she finally heard horses approaching. Grace rushed to the window, peering anxiously into the darkness. Relief flooded her when she recognized Vaughn's tall figure dismounting in the yard. He appeared unharmed, though his expression was grim as he spoke with Sheriff Davis. Unable to wait any longer, Grace hurried outside, ignoring her earlier promise to stay indoors. Vaughn looked up at her approach, his face softening. "It's all right," he called. "It's over." As she drew closer, Grace could see several men slumped over their saddles, hands bound behind them. Sheriff Davis was giving instructions to his deputies about guarding the prisoners. "You got them all?" she asked, coming to stand beside Vaughn. He nodded. "All 5. There was a brief shootout, but no one was seriously hurt." He gestured to a blood-stained bandage on his arm that Grace hadn't noticed. "Just a graze." "You're hurt," she exclaimed, immediately examining the wound. "It's nothing," Vaughn assured her. One of the deputies already bandaged it. Sheriff Davis approached them. "Miss Reynolds, we found your belongings among their saddlebags. Your trunk was too large for them to carry, but we recovered this." He handed her a small reticule. Grace accepted it with trembling hands, recognizing the embroidered bag her mother had made for her. Inside, remarkably, she found her mother's cameo brooch and the small amount of money she'd been carrying. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more than I can say." Davis nodded. "We'll need you to come to town sometime next week to give your statement about the stagecoach robbery. These men will be facing multiple charges." "Of course," Grace agreed. The sheriff turned to Vaughn. "We'll camp here tonight with the prisoners if that's all right with you." "Too dangerous to travel in the dark." "Of course," Vaughn agreed. "Use the barn, there's plenty of fresh hay." As the sheriff organized his men and the prisoners, Vaughn gently guided Grace back toward her cabin. His arm slipped around her waist and she leaned into him, suddenly exhausted now that the danger had passed. "You should let me look at that wound properly," she said as they walked. "Later," Vaughn promised. "Right now, I just want to finish the conversation we started earlier." Inside the cabin, with the door closed against the night and the chaos outside, they stood facing each other in the soft lamplight. Vaughn took her hands in his thumbs tracing circles on her skin. "When I saw you on the side of that road," he began, his voice low and earnest, "something told me my life was about to change. I didn't know how right that feeling would be." Grace squeezed his hands encouragingly. "These past weeks, working with you, talking with you, watching you with the children." He continued, "I've come to realize something I've never felt before. Grace, I'm in love with you." Though she had hoped for this declaration, hearing the words aloud made Grace's heart soar. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling for you that first night when you shared everything you had without asking anything in return." Vaughn's smile was radiant. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. "I never expected to find love again after all I've seen and done. But you brought light back into my life, Grace. You made me believe in possibilities again." "And you gave me a home when I had nothing," she replied softly. "Not just shelter, but a place to belong." This time when Vaughn kissed her, there was no urgency, no looming separation. His lips moved against hers with tender exploration, deepening as she responded with equal fervor. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands slid up his chest to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "Do things right." Grace smiled, touched by his old-fashioned propriety despite the passionate kiss they'd just shared. "I'd like that," she agreed. They sat together on Grace's small sofa, talking late into the night, sharing hopes and dreams, making plans. Vaughn spoke of expanding the school, perhaps building a proper schoolhouse if more families moved into the area. Grace shared her ideas for adult education classes in the evenings, reading and writing for the ranch hands who hadn't had the opportunity to learn. "You're going to change this community," Vaughn said admiringly. "These people need someone like you." "We'll change it together," Grace corrected him. "Your writing, my teaching, we make a good team." As dawn approached, Vaughn reluctantly rose to leave. "I should check on the sheriff and his men," he said, "and you need some rest before your students arrive." At the door, he kissed her once more, softly and sweetly. "I'll see you later today." "I'll be here," Grace promised. The following weeks brought many changes to the Nicholson ranch. With the Sutton gang in custody awaiting trial, the territory felt safer. More families began settling in the area, and Grace's little school grew to 12 students by Christmas. Vaughn's story was published in Harper's Weekly to modest acclaim, and he received a letter requesting more of his work. With Grace's encouragement, he began writing regularly in the evenings, his confidence growing with each completed tale. Their courtship progressed with the full knowledge and approval of the community. They attended church together in Willow Creek on Sundays, shared meals with neighboring families, and worked side by side to improve both the ranch and the school. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. As winter gave way to spring, Vaughn took Grace on a picnic to a beautiful meadow overlooking a stream that ran through his property. Wildflowers carpeted the ground, and the air was sweet with their fragrance. After they'd eaten, Vaughn seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with his hat and clearing his throat several times. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked, concerned by his behavior. "Nothing's wrong," he assured her quickly. "Just trying to find the right words. For a writer, I'm making a mess of this." "Making a mess of what?" Grace asked, confused. Vaughn took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Grace's heart skipped a beat as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "I've been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment." He took her hand in his eyes never leaving hers. "Grace Reynolds, when I found you on that road, I offered to share everything I had. It wasn't much then, just water, food, and shelter. Now I'm asking you to share everything I am and everything I hope to be. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy filled Grace's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "With all my heart, yes." Vaughn slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise of their future together. They were married in June in the small church in Willow Creek. Grace wore a cream-colored gown she had sewn herself, with lace trim purchased from a traveling peddler. Vaughn looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. Their students attended the ceremony, along with neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had come to know and respect the couple. Sheriff Davis stood as Vaughn's best man, while Widow Carson served as Grace's matron of honor. After the simple ceremony and the celebration that followed, Vaughn drove Grace home in a freshly painted wagon, the back filled with wedding gifts. As they approached the ranch, Grace gasped in surprise. During the day, Louis and Charlie had decorated the porch with wildflowers and hung a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome home, Mrs. Nicholson." "Do you like it?" Vaughn asked, watching her reaction with a smile. "It's perfect," Grace assured him, leaning against his shoulder. "Everything is perfect." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered new dimensions to their love, learning each other's bodies with the same care and attention they'd given to learning each other's minds and hearts. In Vaughn's arms, Grace found a passion she had never imagined possible, matched only by the tenderness in his eyes as he whispered his love against her skin. As they lay together in the quiet aftermath, Vaughn traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. Grace smiled, nestling closer to him. "I was thinking about that day on the road, how close I came to giving up if you hadn't come along when you did." "But I did," Vaughn reminded her, "and I always will, whenever you need me, however you need me." "I know," Grace said softly. That's what makes you the man I love." 2 years later, Grace stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Vaughn rode in from checking the herd. Their 1-year-old daughter, Rebecca, balanced on her hip while her free hand rested on her again swollen belly. The school had grown to 20 students and now occupied a proper schoolhouse built on the ranch property. Vaughn's stories appeared regularly in magazines, and he was working on a novel based on his experiences during the war. As he dismounted and strode toward them, his face lighting up at the sight of his family, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude. From desperation on a lonely road to this abundant life, it had all begun with a cowboy who took off his hat and offered to share everything he had. Vaughn reached them, sweeping little Rebecca into his arms and planting a kiss on Grace's lips. "How are my girls today?" he asked, his hand gently caressing her rounded stomach. "We're perfect," Grace assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Everything is perfect." And as the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Grace knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, sharing everything they had, everything they were, everything they would become. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter on a dusty road had led to a love deeper and richer than either of them could have imagined. It was a love born of kindness and courage, nurtured by shared dreams and common purpose, and destined to grow stronger with each passing day in the vast, beautiful wilderness they called home.